Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's story. In this episode, James's perfect proposal shatters when Diep suddenly collapses and is rushed to the hospital. There, he learns she has a rare illness threatening both her and their unborn child. Shaken but determined, James abandons his grand plans and proposes by her bedside, where Diep accepts with tears. From that moment, he vows to fight for her and their baby, no matter the cost. Through sleepless nights and impossible choices, their love is tested not by romance, but by endurance. Watch until the end to see how James's devotion becomes the ultimate proof of true love. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us. The evening air was heavy with unspoken tension as James sat across from his mother in the living room. The soft ticking of the clock filled the silence while he gathered the courage to speak. Finally, he drew in a steadying breath and broke the stillness. "Mom, tonight I'm going to propose to Diep," he said, his tone calm, but his eyes betraying the storm inside him. His mother's gaze lingered on him, sharp and searching. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, folding her hands as though weighing the gravity of his words. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, every syllable deliberate. "James, you know Diep is not like the other women you've known. She has no family to stand behind her, no formal education to fall back on. Life with her will not be simple." Her words cut quietly but deeply. Still, James did not flinch. He leaned forward, determination steady in his voice. "I understand that, Mom, but I love her. And whatever hardships come our way, I'm ready to face them with her." For a moment, the air grew unbearably thick. His mother's eyes softened slightly, yet a shadow of concern remained. She released a long sigh, her voice quiet but resolute. "If you're truly sure of this, then I won't stand in your way." "But James," she paused, her gaze piercing. "The road ahead will not be kind." James nodded, a bittersweet relief washing over him. Her approval was what he had hoped for, but her warning clung to him like a whisper of things to come. As he rose to leave, her eyes followed him, heavy with unspoken fears. He carried that weight in his chest, but his heart burned with one truth. His love for Diep was worth it all. That love propelled him into the night, his steps quick with anticipation. The restaurant was glowing with soft candlelight, a picture-perfect scene crafted with meticulous care. Red roses bloomed across the VIP table, balloons shimmered under the golden light, and a cake sat elegantly, its scent sweetening the air. James stood amidst the setting, his heart thundering in his chest. Tonight, he would finally ask Diep to become his wife, a moment he had replayed in his mind countless times. Everything was perfect. Everything except her absence. He checked his watch, each second biting into his nerves. That morning, she had been radiant, full of excitement for their dinner. Why wasn't she here yet? A sudden buzz from his phone shattered the poised silence. He pulled it out, expecting perhaps a message from her. Instead, his eyes froze on the words glowing on the screen. "Diep collapsed. Come quickly." In an instant, the world tilted. His breath caught, and before he could even think, his legs were moving. He bolted from the restaurant, leaving behind roses, candles, and the carefully planned proposal. The night blurred as he raced through the streets, his chest pounding not from exertion, but from sheer terror. When he arrived at her home, the sight stopped his heart. Diep lay motionless on the floor, her face pale and ghostly, her lips drained of color. Concerned neighbors clustered around, voices hushed with worry. She fainted suddenly, one explained, but James barely heard. He dropped to his knees, gathering her in his arms, his voice breaking into a desperate whisper. "Diep, please, stay with me. Don't leave me now." Her hand hung limply, cold against his trembling fingers. The ring he had planned to place on her tonight weighed like lead in his pocket, forgotten. There was no space left for dreams of candlelight or vows. There was only fear, raw, suffocating fear. He swept her up into his arms and rushed out, each step pounding with urgency. The city lights streaked past as he sped to the hospital, every breath a prayer, every heartbeat a plea. Love, he realized, wasn't just about grand gestures or perfect nights. It was about this, the brutal, terrifying fight against fate's cruelty. The hospital swallowed them in harsh white light and the scent of antiseptic. Machines beeped rhythmically, their cold sounds echoing the fragility of life itself. Doctors and nurses moved swiftly, surrounding her, attaching wires and tubes. James stood frozen at her bedside, his chest hollowing as he watched them battle against time. At last, the doctor approached, his expression grave. His words struck like a thunderclap. "Diep has a rare condition. It is threatening not only her health, but also the life of her unborn child." James felt the floor vanish beneath him. His proposal, his carefully planned future, it all fractured in an instant. The news cut deeper than any blade. His mind raced back to the signs, her tiredness, her fleeting moments of pain, the way she brushed them aside. He had missed it all, blinded by his eagerness to plan the perfect night. "I should have seen it sooner," he whispered to himself, guilt clawing at his chest. "I should have asked her to marry me long ago, before this." He sat beside her, his hand wrapping around hers, desperate for warmth. But her skin was cold, her face pale, her body fragile against the tide of illness. Tears blurred his vision as he stared at her, remembering her smile, the way her eyes lit up even after a life marked by hardship. Now, she was slipping away before his eyes, and with her, their future. The room pressed in around him, suffocating, the steady beep of machines mocking his helplessness. Yet in that crushing despair, a seed of resolve took root. He couldn't give up. Not now, not ever. She was his anchor, his reason, his love. If fate demanded a fight, then he would give everything he had. The hours bled together, heavy with fear. His grip on her hand never loosened, as though he could tether her to this world through sheer will. Every monitor's beep reminded him of the battle they were in. Each sound, another reminder of the fragile line they walked. And then, a faint stir. Diep's eyelids fluttered, her breathing shallow but real. Slowly, with effort, her eyes opened. She blinked, her gaze dazed, scanning the sterile room. When her eyes finally met his, recognition dawned, and a soft whisper escaped her lips. "James, where am I?" His heart cracked at the frailty of her voice. He leaned close, clasping her hand tightly. "You're in the hospital, my love. You collapsed, but you're safe now." She tried to move, but pain racked her body, forcing a soft cry from her lips. Tears gathered in her eyes as the truth pressed down. She already knew the answer before he spoke it. "The illness, it's affecting your pregnancy," James said quietly, his throat tight. Her lips trembled, and a tear traced down her cheek. "I didn't want to burden you with this," she whispered, regret heavy in her tone. James brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, his eyes unwavering. "You didn't drag me into anything. I chose this. I'm here because I love you, and I'm not going anywhere." Their eyes locked, their silence deeper than words. She squeezed his hand weakly, her strength faint, but her love blazing steady. For a moment, the cold hospital walls seemed to fade, replaced by the fragile warmth of their bond. James held her hand as though it were the only thing keeping him alive. And maybe it was, because in that fragile moment, as machines hummed and shadows loomed, love was their only rebellion against the cruelty of fate. The night dragged on, every minute stretched thin with dread. James sat by Diep's bedside, refusing to move, afraid that if he let go, even for a moment, she might slip away. The hospital lights cast sharp shadows on the walls, painting the room in stark contrasts: life and death, hope and despair. The doctor returned in the early hours, his expression still grim. "Her condition is complex," he said carefully. "It's a rare autoimmune disorder. Pregnancy has triggered a severe reaction. We'll do everything possible, but there are risks for both her and the baby." James felt the words crash over him like icy water. Risks for Diep, for their child. His hand tightened around hers instinctively. He had spent weeks planning the perfect proposal, imagining laughter and rings, promises whispered under candlelight. Now those dreams felt like fragile glass, shattering against the hospital floor. But beneath the fear, a steady fire grew. He would not let fate decide this battle alone. He would stand, fight, plead, do anything to keep her safe. Hours later, Diep stirred again. Her eyes opened slowly, heavy with exhaustion, yet filled with quiet strength. James leaned in quickly, his voice soft but urgent. "Don't push yourself," he whispered. "Just rest." She gazed at him, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "I thought tonight you had a surprise for me," she murmured weakly, her voice almost fading into the hum of machines. The words pierced him. The ring in his pocket felt heavier than ever, burning like a reminder of everything he hadn't said. He pulled it out, his hands trembling, and held it before her. "I was going to ask you to be my wife," he admitted, his voice breaking. "But it doesn't matter where we are or how grand the setting is. What matters is this. I love you, Diep, with all that I am. And I don't need candlelight or roses to tell you that. I just need you to know it." Her eyes glistened, tears slipping free. Slowly, she reached out, her weak fingers brushing against the ring. "James," she whispered, emotion trembling in her tone. "Even now, when I may not have much time, you still choose me?" "Always," he said fiercely, pressing her hand to his lips. "Even if the world falls apart, I'll still choose you." Her tears flowed freely now, but a smile curved her lips. Then, yes, I'll be your wife, for however long fate allows me. The words hung in the sterile air, fragile yet powerful. James slipped the ring onto her finger, his vision blurred with tears. It wasn't the proposal he'd planned, but in that moment, it was more real, more meaningful than any perfect dinner could have been. They sat together, their hands clasped, silent vows exchanged without need for grand speeches. The machines beeped steadily, bearing witness to their promise. Love, even when threatened by shadows, had found its voice. But reality was unforgiving. The days that followed were a whirlwind of tests, consultations, and restless nights. James stayed by her side through it all, rarely leaving except when the nurses insisted. He learned medical terms he had never heard before, clung to statistics and probabilities, but most of all, he clung to hope. One night, while Diep slept, James stepped into the hallway, his shoulders sagging under the weight of exhaustion. His mother stood there, waiting quietly. Her eyes softened when she saw the lines of worry etched deep into his face. "You love her," she said simply. No longer a question, but a truth. "I do," James replied, his voice hoarse. "More than I ever thought possible. And now I might lose her." His mother sighed, her expression a mixture of sorrow and reluctant acceptance. She placed a hand on his arm. "Then fight for her. Don't just wait for doctors to tell you what's possible. Find answers. Find strength. That's what love demands." Her words struck deep. For the first time, James saw not resistance in her eyes, but solidarity. She was scared too, but she understood. And she was telling him what he already knew. Love wasn't passive. It demanded everything. The next morning, James threw himself into action. He sought specialists, researched treatments, pressed for every option available. Some doors closed, but others cracked open. There were therapies, experimental procedures, faint glimmers of hope. The road would be grueling, but it wasn't entirely dark. When he shared the possibilities with Diep, she looked at him with quiet wonder. "Why do you fight so hard?" she asked softly. He knelt beside her, taking her frail hand into his. "Because you're my future, you and our child. I can't imagine a world without you in it. And if there's even a single chance, I'll chase it to the ends of the earth." Her eyes filled again, but this time not only with sorrow, with gratitude, with love. "James, whatever happens, I need you to promise me something." "Anything," he said instantly. "If it comes to choosing between me and the baby, choose the baby." The words struck like lightning, leaving him breathless. "Don't say that," he whispered harshly. "Don't you dare ask me to choose." But she looked at him with calm resolve, her voice steady despite her weakness. "Promise me, James, because even if I can't stay, our child can carry a part of me forward." He shook his head, tears spilling freely. "I can't. I won't. I'll fight for both of you. I won't let either of you go." The silence that followed was heavy, their eyes locked in a battle between love and fear. At last, she squeezed his hand weakly, her smile sad but tender. "Then fight for us, my love, with everything you have." And he did. The days stretched into weeks, each one a crucible of fear and resilience. James became a constant presence at the hospital, learning the rhythm of her medications, sitting through procedures, whispering words of comfort through the long nights. Whenever her strength faltered, he reminded her of their dream, the home they would build, the life they still longed for, the child they were waiting to hold. There were setbacks, moments when the doctors shook their heads, moments when hope seemed thin as thread. But then there were small victories, a day when her color returned, a night when she slept without pain, a morning when she smiled faintly at the ring on her finger and whispered, "I'm still here." And with each fragile step, James's resolve only grew stronger. He no longer thought of candlelit restaurants or carefully crafted proposals. Love had stripped itself bare, revealing its truest form. Not roses or perfection, but staying when everything else fell apart. One evening, as he sat by her bed, watching her breathe steadily in sleep, James whispered to the quiet room, "We'll make it through this, Diep. You, me, and our baby, no matter what it takes." The monitors hummed softly, steady and reassuring. For the first time in weeks, James allowed himself a small smile. Their future was uncertain, the road steep and merciless. But in that moment, with her hand in his and their child still fighting within her, hope felt possible. Love had not been defeated. It had only just begun to prove its strength.